Hello and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Perils of Email Overretention, What You Need to Know. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. If you're interested in trying out the enterprise version of Harmony, please send us a request in the chat window and someone will contact you after the webinar to get you started. We'll also make a recording of the webcast available to you within a couple of days. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer of EMEA at Harmony. Richard heads up the pre-sales team for Harmony across the EMEA and Asia Pacific regions, working both directly with key accounts as well as Harmony's partner channel. Bringing with him almost 20 years of experience in data management systems, Richard has helped many companies to realize the significant benefits in productivity that collaborative platforms enable. Before joining Harmony in 2011, Richard worked for Dassault Systems PLM for over 10 years. Richard also has a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Automotive Engineering from Loughborough University. Richard, please get us started.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this month's session. I think that the first thing that we wanted to kind of highlight is to look at the background of email management, the type of emails that people receive. You can kind of categorize into 3 main areas, for a typical business user. And I think, the vast majority of emails in people's mailboxes are kind of not really important emails. They're what we class as rot emails, so redundant, old, or transient or trivial email messages. So it's stuff that you don't need to keep. You've read it, it can go. But some people are very structured in the way that they delete those type of emails. A lot of people kind of just read it and then it stays in their mailbox until something gets done with it. But obviously there are important emails that should be declared as records and need to be retained for compliance reasons and the traditional kind of records management requirements. But it's not just those 2 extremes of very important emails that should be declared as records and everything else should be deleted. There's a lot of content as well in between that are important business emails that I don't necessarily want to delete because it's got something that I may want to reuse in the future. Maybe somebody's asked me a question and I might get asked the same question in 6 months' time, so I want to keep that email because I've got the response that I sent to them as well, or whatever. So it's important that those don't just stay in my mailbox, but could be shared with my colleagues as well, so that they can be found and information can be reused. Also emails that aren't necessarily contractual emails, but may have some reference that you may need to go back to in the future for clarity on what was said, what was done, what was discussed. So putting those into some repository where they're organized, that's shared, so it's not just a personal mailbox, where it can be classified and organized, but also so that it can be found in the future. And there's obviously a lot of different ways to do that. So with that, we'd just like to ask you what your current implementation or plans are around managing emails.
So please let us know, how do you currently or are you planning to store your important business emails and email records? Are you storing them in SharePoint, in Exchange? Are you using Microsoft Teams, some other document management system, or you're looking for a solution? Thank you for letting us know. Let me show you the responses, Richard.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So, I mean, obviously, the largest portion of the audience here are or are planning to store emails in SharePoint. That may be because, obviously, your existing customers are of ours or prospects that we're already talking to, and you're looking for a solution like Harmony. But obviously, there are an element of people storing and managing emails in Exchange. And I think a lot of people are starting to look at utilizing Teams as well. And it may be that you're at the early stages of your journey with Teams and how that can be used to manage both email communication but also documentation. And it may be that you've highlighted, you've looked at that and you've highlighted some gaps where it's not quite meeting your requirements. So we'll have a look at some solutions and some of the problems around email management or the challenges, or as we've said in the slides, the perils that you need to kind of overcome when you're talking about kind of retaining those important emails. I think the first one really is, there's always a battle between the kind of compliance managers who basically want everything deleted as quickly as possible, so that a company can maintain compliance for things like GDPR, for example, so that you're not keeping information that you shouldn't be keeping for any longer than you need to. As I say, like if an email has been read and I don't need to do anything with it, then it should be deleted. But that kind of often has is very opposing to what the business require, which is, maybe like I want to keep everything because there are people who keep their mailbox as really don't delete anything because they always want to be able to recover a piece of communication that they had previously. And so there's always a challenge between the two, and I think um, the mistake that some people make is that expecting that somebody else is going to actually dictate a policy, and then the users will have to adhere to that, and that it will meet all the requirements of both the business and the kind of compliance point of view. And it's always a challenge, as I say, to find a happy ground between the two and satisfy both requirements. And I think from that, it can often be a case that the solution can be overcomplicated. Where you could spend a long time, months or years, putting together retention policies and the way people should work and operating procedures and this, that, and the other, which end users are then going to be very much confused by, because they don't necessarily know, okay, well, I want this email, I'd like to keep this email, but what should I do with it? So in some respects, they have to kind of spend a bit of time to consider, okay, what should I do and where should I put it? So I think the way to address that is to make it as easy as possible for the end user and the business user to actually do the right thing, and really focus on their experience and what it takes for them to meet the policy rather than just the policies themselves. So something that we've been doing at Harmony for pretty much 10 years now is giving those end users an easy way to capture, classify, and declare content as records in SharePoint. Being able to drag and drop content from your email, from your mailbox into SharePoint, so that you've then got potentially different retention policies in your mailbox as you do in the SharePoint library. Once something's been put into SharePoint, it could have like maybe a 10-year retention policy, whereas stuff in your mailbox might have a 2-year retention policy or something. And so you've got a mechanism to be able to say, okay, stuff that's in my mailbox that I don't manually delete will automatically get deleted after a period of time. But anything that I do need to keep, I can put it into SharePoint, I can classify it with metadata so that it can be easily found and managed and shared with other people. But as I say, it could have different retention policies and mechanisms enabled on that as well. So as I say, we've obviously been doing that for a long time now. I think some of the people on this call may be customers that can testify that that solution is been working really, really well for them. So the third area is kind of losing the connection between related records. So, like it might be that I've got other related emails that are connected together because they relate to the same project I'm working on or whatever, or there's documents in SharePoint and emails in Exchange that should be related together, but maybe you're managing your emails in SharePoint, emails in Exchange, or leaving them in people's mailboxes, or maybe in the past you've used public folders or something, and then the documentation is in SharePoint. So there's not really a link between the two because they're two completely different repositories in SharePoint and Exchange. And I think even if you put content into one place, which is again something that we've been kind of advocating for a long time now, is you could have common metadata in the same location. You can put your emails and your documents together, and so that you can manage those by metadata, by common metadata, and by a common location. But there's still kind of like a focus on where do you put the content, and the fact, obviously in SharePoint you can have many sites and site collections and libraries and things. And from an end user's point of view, they don't necessarily want or need to think about, okay, what location am I putting this in, but more what's the context of the content that I'm actually capturing. So with that, we'd just like to ask you a question about labels that Microsoft has obviously been implementing over the last couple of years.
So are you using Microsoft labels to apply retention policies? You're doing it in place, that is your emails in Exchange, your documents in SharePoint. Yes, you're doing it with emails and documents in SharePoint. Only for emails in Exchange, only for documents in SharePoint, or not at all? Thank you for answering. We'll let it up for a minute so you all have a chance to. And Richard, let me show you the results.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And again, thank you everybody for responding. So there's quite a large proportion of people that aren't using labels yet. Maybe it's something that you're looking at, something that you're planning or considering. But I think there's a lot of kind of focus, certainly from a Microsoft point of view, on how labels can be used for retention policies and for security, or the kind of the areas that that labels have been implemented for. And I think they are, in some ways, it's slightly limited because it's focused on retention and security rather than the actual business context and the classification of, okay, what type of information the content actually relates to, not just how long should it be kept for, or what the security should be. So the fourth area that we highlighted was taking on too much at once. I think it's always quite difficult if if you've come maybe from another system or an on-premise instance of the Office tools and SharePoint and Exchange and things, and you're moving to Office 365, for example, and you're looking at the whole company with all their requirements. It can be very difficult, and you end up getting bogged down in a lot of detail because you're trying to please everybody all the time, and trying to find a perfect solution that fits all. So I think the way to address that is obviously to focus on kind of logical groups in an organization, and focus on maybe like specific requirements for specific groups, and have an overriding platform for everybody, for general document management, for example. And also kind of focus in order of priority. You know, some people start with focusing on moving email into Exchange Online, for example, and how to manage those, or documents into SharePoint and how to manage those with metadata, because maybe you've come from a folder structure on file shares and you're looking to use the capabilities of SharePoint and metadata and version control and all that kind of stuff. So it can be a lot to take on, not only from an architecture point of view and a technology point of view, but also from a user point of view. So that kind of change management is a massive hurdle for end users as well. And I think also the last point that we wanted to make was, obviously, as a business user, you want to be able to find the information that you need quickly and easily so that you can get your job done, so that you can reply to, you know, a request for proposal or a contract that's been sent or whatever. And if content hasn't been classified in, let's say, a uniform manner, maybe you've got emails in a public folder, for example, and you've got documents in SharePoint in maybe a folder structure or maybe some metadata. There's no easy way to get that content together and search in one place, because if they are disjointed, then it's very difficult for people to find the information. You might have the content, but if it hasn't been classified well and that classification hasn't been applied across the different repositories, then it's very difficult or it's very time consuming to get what you need and reply. So I'd like to introduce some new concepts that we're looking to roll out in the next few months with Harmony. And that is to give you the option to be able to actually save emails and documents into Office 365. As an example here, we've got, you know, like a team, where a team has you know, channels, and you may have you know, emails going into a team mailbox and documents going into a SharePoint site that's associated with the team, or in this case, the, you know, the channel maybe. So being able to get the content into the various repositories, but linking them together because they're part of the same team, is a real key benefit. So for example, like we've seen before with kind of like traditional Harmony of dragging and dropping an email into a SharePoint library, we're going to be able to drag and drop an email into a channel in a team, and the email will go into the mailbox for the team, and the attachment will go into the SharePoint library that's associated with the team. And this is quite a new concept, because I think, as we saw before, you know, people are considering using Teams for communication as well as documentation and email communication as well, because that's what Teams does. It implements parts of that solution, but it's quite difficult to get the content into the right place and to classify it accordingly. So what we're looking to do is firstly support the labels, the retention and the sensitivity labels that Microsoft has implemented in Exchange and SharePoint, so that when you're saving that content to, as I say, a team in this instance, we're able to, you know, classify or label both the email in the mailbox and the document in the SharePoint library, but also add additional metadata to both the email and the document. So again, traditionally, you know, when you've put content into SharePoint from Harmony, you can fill in the metadata, we can map information and stuff, and it can inherit things. But as we saw before, as one of those perils was, if you know, if you can't classify both the document and the email together, but you actually want to put the email into Exchange and the document into SharePoint, Exchange doesn't have the concept of metadata. So what we're looking to do is add additional labels that we're calling descriptive labels, which is basically the metadata coming from the library that the document is going to, and adding that as information to the email in the mailbox, as well as the document in SharePoint. So you've got common metadata across both email and the document, and you've got that context between the two, so that that isn't lost when you're classifying and capturing the content into Office 365. And then what we're doing is being able to utilize that metadata that you're adding both to the emails and to SharePoint to actually find related information as well. So for example, if you then select the email that's been saved into a team, we'll see the metadata or the descriptive labels that have been added to that email, and we'll be able to use those to retrieve other related content from the rest of my Office 365 environment. And it could be content from the same team, for example, but it could be content from other teams that I'm a member of, SharePoint sites that I've got access to, or email mailboxes that I've got access to as well, whether it's my mailbox, a team mailbox, or whatever, but only content and locations that you have permission to access, so that you can easily find related information and respond accordingly to the corresponding information. So it really addresses all of those 5 areas that we discussed of making it as easy as possible for end users to do the right thing, making it intuitive and quick, but adding the context and the classification to both emails and documents, irrelevant of where you're putting it in your Office 365 environment. And I think we've got a great use case that was presented, I think, a few months ago, or certainly in the last few months, by Hilton. So Hilton, I'm sure most people are familiar with Hilton Hotels. They've been a customer of Harmony's for a few years now. And the main focus that they had really is being able to declare records in SharePoint in a user-friendly and efficient way, but be able to actually remove content that doesn't need to be kept as well. So it's those two, that kind of flip side of those two opposing kind of views of, you know, a compliance manager who wants to delete everything and the business user who wants to keep everything. And they had real kind of issues around making it as easy as possible for people to be able to do that and store those records in SharePoint, which is why they purchased and deployed Harmony to about, I think they're up to about 15,000 users right now. I mean, we've got a great, as I say, a presentation from Bill Zachlis from Hilton at one of our events over the last month or two, where he talks about their experience and the benefits that Harmony has brought them. And in fact, over the space of, I think it's pretty much like 3 or 4 months, they were able to identify and capture about 40,000 emails as records from people's mailboxes into SharePoint. And that allowed them to then delete and get rid of over 35 million emails from people's mailboxes that didn't need to be kept, because obviously, you know, things like GDPR and other kind of regulatory compliance issues mean that, you know, you shouldn't be storing content that you don't need to. And also they're able to, you know, obviously put a more aggressive retention policy on people's mailboxes, but give them the opportunity to declare something that they need to keep as a record that they can then keep for a longer period of time, depending on, obviously, you know, like the type of content it is. So that there'll be a video presentation of that event. I think it'll be posted on our website shortly. And with that, I think we'd just like to ask you one last question.
Great. So please let us know if you'd like to be contacted by a Harmony representative, if you're an existing customer and you have questions, if you'd like to trial Harmony, if you just have questions. And in the meantime, excuse me, let me ask Richard the questions that you have asked during his presentation. Richard, how do I install the Smart Assistant that you were just talking about? Do I need
Okay.
something on the server?
Yeah, so if we just go back a few slides just to kind of look at that in a bit more detail. So yeah, absolutely. The kind of smart assistant was what we were kind of intending to give you the ability to capture that content into the right places. And apply those labels and descriptive labels and things. So at the moment, this is going to be kind of like a two-phase implementation. What we've described here is purely client-side. So there's no server component that's required. It's all done in the Harmony client that you may or may not already be using, but in the next version, which we're planning for the end of September. And then what we'll do once we've got that, we'll be able to add additional functionality, which will require a server component, a managed app in Azure, which would still be in your own environment, but it then gives us the ability to use machine learning to actually give more suggestions to you of which team you may want to save it to or what location. And also actually give you some kind of indication of what type of content has already, if something similar has been saved already, or whether this email should or shouldn't be retained as kind of smart recommendations. And so there will be a server component that will add additional AI capabilities, but what we're talking about today is purely in the client side.
Thank you. And how much does this cost, this Smart Assistant?
So the Smart Assistant, because it's in the client, it's included in, or it will be included in the normal Harmony license fee. As I say, the server component to do with the AI may be an additional cost because it's a server kind of solution that integrates to this and gives you extra functionality, but it wouldn't be necessarily a requirement for the functionality that we're talking about here.
Okay. How does it differ from what I get from Microsoft out of the box?
Okay, so obviously Microsoft has the Teams app, has Outlook, has SharePoint in a browser typically, and so it's quite disjointed. If you go into the Teams app as an example, you'll see a list of your teams and the channels, and you can get to, for example, the conversation in a channel and post from there, and you can add different apps and things. But firstly, it's another interface for people to move to, and most business users don't particularly like change. So they're spending time in Outlook, which Microsoft doesn't give a kind of a decent integration between SharePoint, Teams, and Outlook. So it's that level of integration first, but also things like if I want to save content to a SharePoint site that's associated with a team, then you've kind of got to go through three kind of interfaces. So for example, if I receive this email that we've got on the screen here with an attachment and I want to get that contract, for example, into the SharePoint site that's associated with a channel of a team, then I would have to download that document locally. I'd probably then go into the team to find the team that I'm looking for. And then if I put the content into the SharePoint library from the Teams interface, Teams doesn't actually prompt me for any metadata or give me an interface to see or use or enter the metadata. So I then have to open that location up in a browser to go into the SharePoint interface to use the metadata. So that's where Harmony's bringing all of those together and giving it to you in a very, very streamlined interface, but also, as we mentioned about metadata on emails. Microsoft doesn't have any capability out of the box to classify emails in, for example, a team mailbox and organize them. You end up with one mailbox with a flat structure of emails. You kind of have to forward an email to the team mailbox in order for it to be saved there. Um, so obviously, forwarding emails is a bit different to capturing an email that you've actually received, because it might change the context. You may have changed the text, for example, and you lose the kind of header information that was related to the email that was actually received or actually sent. And so we're using the Office 365 capabilities to actually write information to the email messages as well, to use that kind of metadata to classify both the emails and the documents.
Thank you. Is the Smart Assistant available for on-premise SharePoint?
So, I mean, this is focused around Teams, which is an Office 365 component. You don't have Teams for on-premise. Obviously, Harmony does work with SharePoint on-premise. We have many customers working in that way, and I'm sure we will do for many years. But there is definitely a big move towards Office 365, and particularly around using Teams and labels and all the things that we've been discussing here are Office 365 components. So it's really down to what we can do with the platform that you actually have.
There we go. Was the capturing of 40,000 records from the emails at Hilton done automatically, or did users do it individually? Do you know, Richard?
Users did it themselves. It wasn't automated in any way, really. I mean, Harmony does allow you to automate a user capturing emails using Outlook rules, for example. But I know that they were doing it, and some of the key benefits that they saw that Harmony offered to support this capture of the email records was, one, the kind of ease of drag and drop for end users to do it, because at the end of the day, the user has the knowledge to say, what do I need to keep? What do I want to keep? And they were able to, drag and drop, multiple emails. So actually, I think Bill talked about being able to, or users were saving 100 emails at a time from their mailbox into relevant SharePoint libraries. So you can do it, like in chunks, rather than kind of automating the process, because it's a process that you can't really automate. You can't create one rule that kind of fits everything. And so it was more a user operation that they were implementing, and still are.
Thank you. And I think one last question. The descriptive label that you were talking about, is
Mhm.
that a Microsoft construct or is it a Harmony feature?
So as I say, we're kind of like looking to take the information and read it from the associated SharePoint library. So all the metadata that you're currently kind of used to having in the Harmony sidebar. So it could be managed metadata, enterprise keywords, lookups, all those kind of things. But then actually save that as values in the Microsoft graph against the email. Which is a capability that the graph offers, and we're able to actually write to that. So we're utilizing Microsoft technologies in the background and underlying technologies, but we're kind of writing to those. So we're taking it from SharePoint and writing it to the graph against the email in a mailbox.
Thank you. Richard, thank you for that presentation. Thank you all for joining us today. If we haven't answered your questions, we'll reach out to you after the webinar. You'll receive an email with a link to view the webinar again within a couple of days. We'll see if we can add a link to view the information from Hilton as well. And we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar. Thank you.